Hey everyone, welcome back. We're doing a deep dive today into something one of you asked about, and I think it's really interesting, the future of American agriculture under President-elect Trump.
Okay.
Yeah, and you specifically asked to get a handle on what Brooke Rollins' nomination for Secretary of Agriculture. I don't know what that means.
Right.
And we've got a really interesting mix of articles here from The Guardian, BBC, Fox News.
Wow, a good range.
Yeah, to help us kind of figure that out. It's not just about okay, who's in charge, but what does this mean for farmers, consumers, trade deals?
Absolutely.
What is going to be on my plate?
Yeah, and Brooke Rollins herself is a really interesting place to start because her background is this fascinating mix.
Yeah.
Someone who comes from a small town ag background, but also has this really high-powered policy experience.
Right, you don't see that every day. Small town, Texas, farm girl, future farmers of America, 4-H. And then law degree, works in the White House, led the America First Policy Institute.
Yeah, I think that experience at the America First Policy Institute is going to be really key in this role. That organization has been very closely involved with shaping policy for Trump's incoming administration.
Interesting.
So her appointment there really suggests a strong alignment between, what the administration's agricultural policies are going to be and what that think tank's agenda has been.
So if I'm hearing you right, less government support for farmers, more focus on market forces.
Potentially, yeah. The America First Policy Institute has advocated for things like reducing subsidies and pushing for, more free market principles in farming.
So that could be good for some, but maybe leave others vulnerable, smaller farms that are already struggling.
Yeah, definitely someone to watch.
Didn't one of the articles mention Trump wanting to make America food independent?
Yeah, that's definitely a central piece of his platform, and it could create some friction between those different goals. On the one hand, reducing subsidies could make American farmers more competitive globally, but then on the other hand, achieving food independence might require some level of government intervention to support key industries or incentivize certain crops.
Right, so she's really going to have to walk that line.
She's got a lot to juggle, for sure.
And speaking of juggling, let's talk about the USDA itself. That's a massive agency, right? It's huge. 100,000 employees, offices in every county. They're involved in pretty much every aspect of food production, from farm to table.
Think about the last time you went grocery shopping. The safety of the food that you buy, the labels that tell you where it came from, the inspections that ensure quality. That's the USDA at work.
So Rollins' decisions could directly impact what I see at my supermarket.
Oh, absolutely.
Prices, variety, maybe even the kinds of options that are available.
Exactly. And don't forget trade deals, too.
Oh? Right.
Trump has been pretty vocal about renegotiating agreements like the U.S.-Mexico-Canada deal, and agriculture is always a major sticking point.
Well, yeah, there was all that talk about Mexico trying to ban GMO corn from the U.S.
Exactly, and now Rollins is going to be heading into those negotiations, so things could get pretty intense.
Yeah, and then you add in Trump's, love of tariffs.
Yeah, his America First approach has often involved using tariffs as a way to protect domestic industries. But those tariffs can have ripple effects.
Yeah.
Potentially leading to trade wars and higher prices for consumers.
So it's really this balancing act of trying to support American farmers, but also dealing with the complexities of global trade.
Yeah.
And how much power does she really have to shape policy, given, Trump's pretty strong opinions on these issues?
That's a great question. And it's made even more complicated, I think, when you consider the other players in Trump's cabinet.
You mean the whole cabinet of controversies thing?
Exactly.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr. for Health and Human Services.
Yeah.
That was a big one. And Matt Gaetz saga, with the Attorney General nomination.
Right. And while those appointments might seem unrelated to agriculture, policy decisions rarely happen in isolation.
Right.
These are all very strong personalities with potentially conflicting agendas. And it's hard to say exactly how that dynamic is going to play out.
Yeah. So she's really stepping into a situation with a lot of moving parts, both on the domestic front and internationally.
For sure.
And, the choices that she makes are going to impact us all, whether you're directly involved in agriculture or just, trying to put food on the table.
It really underscores how interconnected all this is. Even if you live in a big city and, haven't set foot on a farm in years, the decisions made at the USDA affect you. They shape what you eat, how much you pay for it, even the environmental impact of our food system.
So, new Secretary of Agriculture, complex background, an agenda that really focuses on food independence and free markets, and a potentially volatile political landscape. I mean, what does this all mean for the average person? Like, how do we even start to make sense of this?
Well, that's where, taking a deep dive like this can be really helpful. We need to understand the different forces at play, the potential, conflicts and compromises that have to be made, and ultimately the different possible outcomes.
So by understanding this big picture, maybe we can make better choices ourselves.
Exactly, both as consumers and as citizens,
So big question here.
Yeah.
What does Brooke Rollins' leadership at the USDA really mean for the future of food and farming in America?
That's what we need to figure out.
And what does that mean for you?
Yeah, what does that mean for you personally?
Because let's be honest, this isn't just about politics and policy. This is about what ends up on your plate. The choices you make at the grocery store.
Yeah.
And the impact that those choices have on the world around us.
Exactly.
It's about finding that balance between feeding a nation and preserving the planet for generations to come.
Well said.
So we're going to take a quick break, and then when we come back, we'll dive even deeper into this fascinating topic. Stay with us.
Yeah, it really is a fascinating issue, isn't it? And it's one that's, evolving so rapidly.
Oh, for sure.
Think about it just a few years ago. Terms like regenerative agriculture and food sovereignty, they weren't really part of the mainstream conversation.
No, they weren't.
And now they're central to the debate about the future of food.
Yeah, you're right. I remember when organic was the big buzzword,
Right.
Now it feels like there's a whole new vocabulary emerging around food and farming.
And it seems like consumers are becoming much more aware of where their food comes from and the impact it has.
Absolutely. People are asking questions like, is this food ethically sourced? Is it good for the environment? Is it supporting, local farmers? These are questions that were barely on the radar a decade ago.
And that shift in consumer awareness, I think, is going to put even more pressure on policymakers like Rollins. They can't just focus on production and efficiency anymore.
Right.
They have to consider the values and concerns of a much more informed and engaged.
So how will she respond to these shifting demands? I mean, will she champion a more holistic approach to agriculture, one that takes into account environmental sustainability, social justice, consumer preferences, or will she, prioritize those traditional metrics like yield and profit?
That's the big question.
And it's one that's going to have ripple effects throughout the whole food system.
Yeah.
If the USDA starts incentivizing, different farming practices, that could change everything from the types of crops that farmers grow to the prices we pay at the supermarket.
I mean, imagine a scenario where the USDA shifts its focus from supporting large-scale monoculture farms to promoting, smaller diversified farms that prioritize soil health and biodiversity.
Okay.
That could lead to a resurgence in regional food systems where consumers have access to fresher, more locally grown produce.
Less reliance on long-distance transportation, more support for local economies, maybe even a boost for rural communities.
Exactly.
But wouldn't that also mean higher prices for consumers, at least in the short term?
It's a possibility, and it's one of the trade-offs that policymakers have to grapple with.
Right.
If we want a more sustainable and resilient food system, we might have to accept that it comes at a cost.
But there's also the potential for, innovation and efficiency gains that could bring prices down over time.
Right.
And technology is going to play a role too.
Oh, absolutely.
Precision agriculture, vertical farming, gene editing. These are all emerging technologies that could revolutionize the way we produce food.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to predict how these advancements will play out, but they're definitely going to be part of the conversation.
Technology will play a major role, but it's not a silver bullet.
Okay.
We still need to address the underlying systemic issues, like the consolidation of the food industry, reliance on fossil fuels, the disconnect between consumers and producers.
So it's not just about finding technological solutions.
It's about changing the way we think about food and agriculture as a whole.
Recognizing that food is not just a commodity, but it's a fundamental part of our culture, our health, and our relationship with the natural world.
And it's about empowering consumers to make informed choices that support a more sustainable and just food system.
Speaking of choices, I'm curious about, your take on the potential impact on food assistance programs.
Yeah.
How might Rollins' approach to agriculture affect programs like SNAP and school lunches?
That's a really critical question and one that deserves careful consideration. If the USDA shifts its priorities towards promoting certain types of agriculture or reducing subsidies, it could have a significant impact on the affordability and accessibility of nutritious food for low-income families.
So we could see changes to the types of foods offered in these programs, maybe more emphasis on certain staple crops or locally sourced produce.
Potentially.
But there's also the risk that these changes could make it harder for people to access the food they need, especially if prices go up.
It's a delicate balancing act and one that requires, careful consideration of the potential consequences. Rollins will need to ensure that any policy changes are implemented in a way that prioritizes the needs of the most vulnerable populations.
So it's not just about feeding the nation.
It's about feeding everyone in the nation equitably, and that means taking into account factors like affordability, accessibility, and cultural preferences.
And it means thinking about the long-term consequences of our choices. We can't just focus on short-term gains or political expediency. We have to consider the impact our decisions will have on future generations.
Absolutely.
It's a complex situation, no easy answers.
No easy answers.
But it's an important conversation to have.
It is.
And one that we as consumers and citizens need to be engaged in.
And a conversation that's only going to become more urgent as we face the challenges of a changing climate, a growing population, and evolving consumer demands.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground: Rollins' background, the political landscape, the potential impacts on farmers, consumers, the environment. But I think it's time to circle back to the big picture.
Yeah, what does it all mean for the future of food and farming in America?
And even more importantly, what does it mean for you, the listener? How might these changes impact your life, your choices, your relationship with food? I mean, it feels like we're at a crossroads here.
Yeah.
On one hand, this incredible opportunity to create a more sustainable, equitable, resilient, food system. But on the other, all these challenges and uncertainties, it's like...
It's true. There are a lot of factors at play. And predicting the future is always a risky business.
Always.
But I think that's what makes it so fascinating. We're not just observers.
Right.
We're participants in actually shaping the future of food.
Okay, so no crystal ball predictions.
Right.
But if we had to distill all this down to a few key takeaways for our listener, what would those be?
Well, first and foremost, I'd say pay attention. Don't just assume that the food system is going to magically take care of itself.
Right.
The choices that we make both individually and collectively have a real impact.
So it's easy to get overwhelmed, with how complex it all is. Yeah. But even small actions can make a difference.
Absolutely.
Whether it's supporting local farmers, reducing food waste, or just being more informed about where your food comes from. Every little bit helps.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to ask questions. Challenge the status quo, demand transparency from the companies you buy from and the policymakers who represent you.
So much of what we talked about, potential changes coming, but ultimately it's up to us, the consumers, to decide what kind of food system we want.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to that question we posed earlier.
Right.
What does Brooke Rollins' leadership at the USDA really mean for you personally? How will you navigate the changing landscape of food and agriculture?
Will you embrace new technologies? Will you advocate for policy changes, support local farmers, or all of the above?
There's no right or wrong answer. But there are choices to be made, and those choices will shape not only your own life, but the future of food for generations to come.
Wow. That's a big thought to leave our listener with.
It is.
But it's an important one, I think.
Yeah.
This isn't just abstract concepts we're talking about. This is something that affects us all on a very fundamental level.
Food is essential. It nourishes us, connects us, sustains us, and the way that we produce it and consume it has, profound implications for our health, our environment, and our society as a whole.
So listener, we encourage you to continue exploring this topic.
Yeah. Dig deeper, ask questions, make informed choices.
Because the future of food is in our hands.
It really is. And it's up to us to shape it wisely.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. I hope you learned something new today, and we'll see you next time.